The vast grasslands of Eurasia stretch endlessly, a boundless horizon where the wind sweeps across rolling plains and the seasons dictate the rhythm of life. For centuries before the Mongols rose to power, these steppes were home to countless tribes and clans, each living as nomads, tied to the movements of their herds and the demands of survival in a harsh, unforgiving environment. It was a world without cities, without walls, without the permanence of stone monuments. Instead, its people lived in felt tents, circular and portable, crafted to withstand the biting cold of winter and the sweltering heat of summer. Their lives were woven into the fabric of nature itself, dependent on horses, sheep, goats, and camels, and bound to the cycles of migration that carried them from one grazing land to another. From afar, to the settled civilizations of China, Persia, and Europe, the steppe appeared empty, a wasteland inhabited by barbarians. Yet those who lived here possessed a culture deeply attuned to survival, mobility, and warfare. Children learned to ride almost before they could walk, growing up with a bow in hand, capable of loosing arrows at full gallop with deadly precision. Horses were more than animals. They were lifelines, companions, and weapons. The steppe bred not only endurance, but a fierce independence, for in a land with no walls and no boundaries, a person's security came not from fortresses, but from loyalty to kin and the strength of their clan. Power among these nomads was never static. Alliances shifted constantly, forged by marriages or broken by betrayal. Rival clans fought over pastures, raided one another for horses and women, and clashed over prestige and survival. The memory of great confederations lingered: the Xiongnu who once threatened the Han dynasty, the Turks whose mounted warriors carved out empires, the Khitans who founded dynasties in northern China. Each had risen and fallen, leaving their mark on the tapestry of the steppe, but no unifying force had yet endured. Instead, fragmentation reigned, with dozens of tribes competing for dominance in a ceaseless dance of war and diplomacy. The Mongols themselves were but one among many, not yet a mighty people, but a scattered collection of clans, herding animals, feuding with neighbors, surviving by skill and ferocity rather than by sheer numbers. They were caught between larger, more powerful forces. To the east lay the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China, a wealthy and settled empire that saw the steppe as both a threat and a resource. To the west stretched the lands of the Karakitai, and beyond them the Islamic world, rich and sprawling. Between these poles, the Mongols seemed insignificant, one more restless tribe on the margins of civilization. And yet, from these humble beginnings, a storm would gather that would reshape the known world. The environment of the steppe itself played a crucial role in shaping its people. Harsh winters culled the weak, forcing resilience upon those who survived. Drought could destroy herds in a season, reducing proud warriors to desperate raiders. Abundance, when it came, was fleeting, and so wealth was measured not in gold or land, but in livestock and the loyalty of followers. To lead on the steppe required not only strength, but generosity, for a chief who could not provide for his warriors soon lost their allegiance. Leadership was always contested, dependent on charisma, cunning, and the ability to bind men together through both fear and reward. Religion among the Mongols was as fluid as their political life. They practiced shamanism, believing in a world alive with spirits, where the eternal blue sky watched over all. Shamans served as intermediaries, performing rituals, offering sacrifices, and guiding the people through visions and omens. Yet the Mongols were not exclusive in their beliefs. They absorbed influences from Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, and Islam, carried to them through trade and conquest. This openness would later become a defining trait of their empire, allowing them to govern vast and diverse populations with a pragmatism rare in their age. Though often dismissed as barbarians, the nomads of the steppe maintained intricate knowledge of survival and strategy. Their mobility was unmatched, their ability to live off the land remarkable. While settled civilizations depended on cities and infrastructure, the nomads needed nothing but their animals and the vast pasture lands. This gave them a flexibility and resilience that baffled their foes. Armies that moved with baggage trains and supply lines found themselves confounded by horsemen who could ride for days, subsisting on dried meat, fermented mare's milk, and even the blood of their horses if necessity demanded it. Such endurance, combined with the bow and the horse, created a military potential unlike any other. For centuries, settled empires tried to control or contain the steppe. The Great Wall of China, stretching across mountains and deserts, was as much a symbol of fear as it was of defense. Tribute, trade, and marriage alliances were offered in hopes of keeping the nomads at bay. But none of these solutions were permanent. Raids continued, cycles of violence repeated, and every empire learned that to neglect the steppe was to invite devastation. Still, few could have foreseen that the Mongols, a people so fragmented and seemingly insignificant, would soon become the most feared conquerors in history. The late 12th century was a time of turbulence on the steppe. Old powers were fading, new leaders were rising, and the balance of tribes shifted with every season. Among the Mongols, rival factions competed for supremacy, and the fate of the people hung in the balance. It was in this world of uncertainty and constant struggle that a child was born near the banks of the Onon River. His name was Temujin, and though his clan was small and his prospects uncertain, his life would alter the destiny of nations. Temujin's early years were steeped in hardship. His father was a chief of modest standing, his family part of the Borjigin lineage, one thread in the tangled web of steppe aristocracy. Yet the security of lineage offered little protection when betrayal struck. At a young age, Temujin would face the brutal realities of steppe politics, the fragility of loyalty, and the ruthless competition that defined his world. Out of these trials, he would forge the strength, ambition, and vision that would make him Genghis Khan. But before that transformation, he was a child of the steppe, living in a world that demanded resilience and cunning from the very first breath. The endless horizon, the restless horses, the constant struggle for survival. This was the crucible in which one of history's greatest figures was born. And as Temujin took his first uncertain steps in a world of danger and possibility, the stage was set for a story that would reshape the destiny of the steppe and the wider world beyond. Temujin's story begins not with triumph, but with loss. His father, Yasuge, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin lineage, had sought to secure his son's future by arranging a marriage with the daughter of a powerful ally. Yet fate intervened cruelly. Returning from this journey, Yasuge accepted hospitality from a rival clan, the Tatars. They offered him food and drink laced with poison, settling an old score, and within days he was dead. Temujin, only 9 years old, was left fatherless, his future uncertain. The death of Yasuge shattered the fragile security of his family. Without a strong protector, the Borjigin clan abandoned the widow and her children, casting them out onto the unforgiving steppe. Temujin's mother, Hoylun, became the backbone of survival, raising her sons in desperate circumstances. They lived by foraging, fishing, and hunting small game, eking out a precarious existence far from the strength of larger tribes. Hunger was a constant companion, and with it came the bitter knowledge of betrayal. For Temujin, childhood was no gentle school. It was a trial by fire, shaping a boy who learned that loyalty could be fleeting, that survival demanded both resilience and cunning. As he grew, Temujin displayed a force of will beyond his years. Yet hardship bred conflict even within his own family. His half-brother Bekta attempted to assert dominance over the household, challenging Temujin's position. The rivalry escalated until Temujin, together with his younger brother Kasar, killed Bekta in a violent confrontation. It was a dark moment, a reminder of the unforgiving nature of steppe life, where even blood ties could fracture under the weight of survival and ambition. For Temujin, it was also the first act of decisive brutality, a glimpse of the ruthless determination that would mark his path. Despite their isolation, Temujin began to form bonds beyond his immediate family. He sought allies among neighboring youths, forging friendships that would prove vital in years to come. Chief among these was Jamuka, a boy of noble descent, with whom Temujin swore an oath of brotherhood, becoming Andas, sole companions. Together they dreamed of power, of uniting men under their banners, of transcending the constant feuding that defined their people. Yet fate would test this friendship, turning it from loyalty into rivalry, from brotherhood into bitter enmity. For now, Temujin's life remained one of struggle. At 16, he married Berta, the woman chosen by his father years before. The marriage brought him not only companionship, but also an important alliance with her tribe, the Ongirat. Yet this newfound stability was soon torn apart. Raiders from the Merkit tribe, seeking vengeance for an old insult committed by Temujin's father, descended upon his camp and carried Berta away. The loss was devastating, threatening to destroy Temujin's fragile hopes of building a family and a future. But here, once again, Temujin showed the steel of his character. Refusing to accept defeat, he sought aid from allies. With the support of the powerful Togrul, Khan of the Keret tribe, and his sworn brother Jamuka, Temujin led a raid against the Merkits and successfully recovered Berta. The rescue cemented his reputation as a leader of promise, a man capable not only of personal bravery, but of rallying others to his cause. Berta would remain by his side throughout his life, her presence a source of stability amid the chaos of war and ambition. As Temujin's reputation grew, so too did the number of followers who gathered around him. He attracted not only relatives, but also men of lower status, those disillusioned with the traditional aristocracy of the steppe. Temujin promised a different order, one based not solely on noble lineage but on loyalty and merit. He rewarded those who served him faithfully, regardless of their birth, and punished betrayal with ruthless severity. This vision began to set him apart from other tribal leaders, for while most clung to the old ways, Temujin was crafting something new, something that would one day become the foundation of empire. The bonds of brotherhood with Jamuka, however, began to fray. Though once united, the two young leaders diverged in their approach to power. Jamuka embodied the old aristocracy, favoring men of noble blood and clinging to tradition. Temujin, by contrast, elevated men of humble origins, reshaping loyalty into a personal bond with himself. The tension simmered until it erupted into open conflict. Their followers divided, and the steppe once again became a battlefield. The struggle between Temujin and Jamuka was fierce. At first, Jamuka struck a terrible blow. In a decisive battle, his forces overwhelmed Temujin's smaller army, capturing 70 young men and subjecting them to a brutal execution, boiling them alive. The savagery of this act horrified many, turning sympathy toward Temujin, who soon rebuilt his strength. Despite the setback, he emerged from the conflict more determined than ever, his vision sharpened by adversity. The rivalry between the two former Andas would define the next stage of Temujin's rise, pitting old traditions against new ambitions. Meanwhile, Temujin's ability to command loyalty grew steadily. He reorganized his followers into units not based on kinship, but on a decimal system of tens, hundreds, and thousands. By breaking down clan loyalties and weaving men into a structure loyal only to him, Temujin dismantled the old order of tribal politics. It was a radical move, one that redefined identity on the steppe. Men no longer fought merely for their clan, they fought for the Khan, for Temujin himself. This system, born in the crucible of his youth, would one day form the backbone of the Mongol army that conquered half the world. The years of hardship had forged in Temujin a resilience unmatched by his rivals. From betrayal by his clan, to the murder of his half-brother, to the kidnapping of his wife, to defeat at the hands of Jamuka, he had endured trials that might have broken another. Yet each challenge only seemed to strengthen his resolve. He learned to adapt, to seize opportunity, to reward loyalty and crush opposition without hesitation. Where others sought only to maintain their power, Temujin sought to transform it, to create unity where there had only been fragmentation. By the close of the 12th century, his star was rising. Though still far from supreme, he had laid the foundations of a new order. He had drawn men to his side with the promise of merit over birth, reorganized his followers into a disciplined force, and demonstrated a will that would not bend even under crushing defeat. The steppe, long divided and chaotic, had found in him a figure who might forge its warring tribes into something greater. The boy abandoned to the wilderness had become a leader of men. The child who once fished to survive now commanded warriors in battle. The young man who had faced betrayal, loss, and rivalry was emerging as a Khan. And though the path ahead would still be marked by blood and struggle, Temujin was no longer merely surviving. He was shaping destiny. Soon, the world beyond the steppe would come to know his name, not as a wandering orphan, but as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The steppe was a world forever shifting, alliances made and broken like the changing winds. By the last years of the 12th century, Temujin had carved a place for himself among the chieftains of Mongolia. Yet survival was not enough. To command real power, he would need more than a loyal band of followers. He would need to unite the fractured tribes of the steppe under a single banner, an ambition that few before him had attempted and none had succeeded in sustaining. His first step was to secure allies of greater stature. Among the most important was Togrul, Khan of the Kherate, whom Temujin regarded as a father figure. Their relationship was born of an earlier debt. Years before, Yesugei had aided Togrul in a time of need, and now Temujin sought to build upon that connection. With Togrul's recognition, Temujin gained legitimacy. The Kherate were powerful, commanding respect and resources that could amplify his own influence. Yet such alliances on the steppe were always precarious, contingent upon loyalty, fear, and mutual gain. Temujin's power grew not merely through alliances, but through his distinctive vision of leadership. Where others demanded loyalty as a birthright of noble blood, he insisted that men prove their worth in service. He elevated generals from the ranks of commoners, men like Subutai and Jebi, whose brilliance in war would later shake empires. By rewarding ability over ancestry, Temujin built an army that was not only loyal but fiercely committed, for every soldier knew that through merit he might rise to the highest ranks. This meritocratic order was revolutionary, undermining the rigid aristocracy of the steppe and creating a force bound together by discipline and ambition. He also demanded strict obedience, instituting a code of law that would later become the foundation of the Yasa. Theft, betrayal, and cowardice were punished with severity, while loyalty and courage were rewarded. The harshness of his rule bred fear, but it also created stability in a land long accustomed to chaos. Where once clans acted only for themselves, now they acted as part of a greater whole. The Mongol army, with its decimal organization and its strict discipline, was becoming more than a tribal force. It was an instrument of empire in the making. Yet Temujin's path to unification was fraught with danger. His alliance with Togrul and his bond with Jamuka, once his closest friend, collapsed under the weight of ambition. Jamuka could not abide Temujin's growing power and his disregard for noble tradition. In 1187, Jamuka declared himself the Gur Khan, the supreme ruler, gathering an army said to number 30,000 warriors. Temujin, with fewer men, nonetheless faced him in open battle. At first, victory seemed within reach, but Jamuka's greater strength overwhelmed him, and Temujin's forces suffered a devastating defeat. The aftermath was brutal. 70 captured young men were executed in horrific fashion, boiled alive as an example to others. It was a moment of darkness, but it also revealed Jamuka's cruelty, driving many to turn away from him and seek out Temujin instead. From the ashes of defeat, Temujin rebuilt. He gathered survivors, forged new alliances, and carefully cultivated loyalty. His charisma, his ability to share spoils, and his reputation for fairness drew disillusioned warriors to his side. Unlike other chieftains, he did not allow looting and pillage to dictate his campaigns. Instead, he distributed wealth systematically, ensuring that even the humblest soldier received his share. This practice distinguished him from rivals who hoarded riches for themselves, and it strengthened the bonds between leader and follower. Over the next decade, Temujin's star rose steadily. He struck down the Tatars, avenging his father's death, and proved himself not only a formidable warrior, but a shrewd strategist. He employed deception in battle, feigned retreats, and lightning raids, always maximizing the mobility of his horsemen. Victories multiplied, and with them his reputation grew. Rival tribes began to bow to his authority, some by force, others by choice, drawn to the stability he promised. By the mid-1190s, his position was strong enough that the Jin dynasty of northern China recognized his power, granting him the title of Chinggis Khan, a name that would echo through history as Genghis Khan. Recognition by the Jin was both an honor and a tool. For Temujin, it cemented his legitimacy among the Mongol tribes, proving that even great empires acknowledged his rule. Yet he remained wary, for he knew that the settled dynasties to the south saw the steppe as both threat and pawn, seeking to divide its tribes for their own purposes. Temujin would accept their titles, but his ambitions extended far beyond being a vassal of foreign rulers. The struggle with Jamukha reignited, but the tide had shifted. Temujin's disciplined forces, bound by loyalty and merit, proved superior to Jamukha's aristocratic followers. One by one, Jamukha's allies deserted him, until at last he was captured. When brought before Temujin, Jamukha requested death without bloodshed, in keeping with the customs of the steppe. Temujin granted this wish, ending the life of his once brother, now bitter rival. With Jamukha's fall, the last major obstacle to unification crumbled. In 1206, after years of struggle, victory, and relentless ambition, a great assembly was called on the banks of the Onon River. Leaders from across the steppe gathered to proclaim Temujin as the supreme ruler of the Mongols. Here, before thousands, he was given the title Genghis Khan, universal ruler, destined to unite not just the tribes of Mongolia, but the world beyond. It was a moment without precedent, for never before had the Mongols been united under a single banner. This unification was not merely symbolic. Genghis Khan had transformed the very structure of Mongol society. He had dismantled the power of traditional aristocracy, replacing it with a merit-based order. He had reorganized tribes into military units loyal to him alone. He had codified laws that bound his people together under a common discipline. And he had instilled in them a vision of destiny, that they were chosen to rule not only the steppe, but all lands under the eternal blue sky. For the Mongols, unification was both an end and a beginning. The endless cycles of tribal feuding were, for a time, broken, replaced by a central authority capable of directing their energies outward. The restless horsemen of the steppe, once raiders on the margins of great empires, were now united into a force that would soon storm across Asia and Europe. Genghis Khan, born from hardship, betrayal, and relentless will, had achieved what no one before him had managed. But uniting the tribes was only the first step. Ahead lay a campaign of conquest that would shake the foundations of the known world. The world beyond the steppe was unprepared for what was coming. To the east, the mighty Jin dynasty controlled northern China, wealthy but divided. To the south, the Song dynasty flourished in the fertile lands of the Yangtze Basin, prosperous but vulnerable. To the west, the Khwarezmian Empire stretched across Central Asia, rich in trade but politically fragile. And beyond them lay kingdoms, principalities and states that had never even heard of the Mongols. Soon they would learn, for the storm that had gathered on the steppe was about to break, and its fury would sweep across continents. The year 1206 marked the birth of a new order on the steppe. For the first time in memory, the Mongol tribes, so long divided by rivalry and blood feuds, were united beneath a single leader. Genghis Khan had forged them into a disciplined people, bound by law, merit, and loyalty to him alone. Yet unification was never meant as an end in itself. For Genghis, it was the beginning of a greater destiny. The Mongols, hardened by years of strife, trained in the unforgiving school of the steppe, were now prepared to test their strength against the world beyond. Their first targets lay close at hand. Old rivalries had not vanished with the proclamation of unity. The Tatars, who had once poisoned his father, were among the first to feel the full fury of Mongol vengeance. With his reorganized army, Genghis struck swiftly, descending upon them with overwhelming speed. His forces moved as one, disciplined and relentless. The Tatars were annihilated, their identity erased from history, their people scattered or absorbed into the Mongol ranks. It was not only an act of revenge, but also a demonstration of what awaited those who opposed the will of the Khan. From the Tatars, the Mongols turned their attention to the Merkit, the tribe that had once abducted Berte, Genghis's wife. Though he had already struck them years before, he now sought final reckoning. With his new allies and the might of his reorganized army, the Merkits were crushed, their remnants fleeing westward. In these early campaigns, Genghis revealed a characteristic that would define his career. He did not allow old grievances to linger unresolved. Every insult, every betrayal was remembered and answered with decisive force. Through these actions, he cemented his reputation as a leader, both feared and respected. But the true test of Mongol power came not from old tribal enemies, but from the great empires that surrounded the steppe. To the east lay the Jin dynasty of northern China, a formidable state that had long dominated the Mongols and their neighbors. The Jin were wealthy, commanding vast resources, and their armies were numerous, yet wealth bred complacency, and the Jin were divided by internal corruption and arrogance. They viewed the Mongols as little more than troublesome barbarians, useful at times as allies or mercenaries, but never as equals. Genghis Khan intended to change that perception. The first clashes with the Jin revealed the brilliance of Mongol warfare. The Mongols fought not as lumbering armies burdened by supply lines, but as swarms of mounted archers moving swiftly across vast distances. Their strategy relied on speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. In battle, they would feign retreat, luring enemies into pursuit, only to wheel around and unleash devastating volleys of arrows. They coordinated attacks across multiple fronts, striking where least expected, and retreating into the steppe when pressed, only to return with renewed force. Against the Jin, Genghis employed not only martial skill, but also cunning diplomacy. He exploited divisions within their realm, forging alliances with neighboring peoples who resented Jin rule. The Khitan, once rulers of their own dynasty, now subjugated by the Jin, became invaluable allies. They provided knowledge of Chinese terrain, fortifications, and weaknesses, enabling the Mongols to strike with precision. With their help, Genghis launched incursions deep into Jin territory, raiding towns and fortresses, testing both his army and the enemy's resolve. These campaigns introduced another element that would become central to Mongol success: the incorporation of conquered peoples. Rather than simply slaughtering or enslaving, Genghis often spared artisans, craftsmen, and skilled individuals, integrating them into his growing empire. Engineers from captured settlements were forced to serve the Mongols, constructing siege engines and learning to adapt Chinese technology to steppe warfare. What the Mongols lacked in their own tradition, such as the ability to take fortified cities, they quickly acquired by absorbing the knowledge of others. One of the most striking features of these early wars was the absolute discipline demanded of Mongol soldiers. Looting before the conclusion of a campaign was forbidden, disobedience punished by death. This iron control distinguished Genghis's forces from the undisciplined raiders of earlier generations. It gave the Mongols a cohesion that astonished their enemies. Villages and towns struck by Mongol raids quickly realized that they faced not merely nomads, but a war machine of terrifying efficiency. By the early years of the 13th century, Genghis had established himself not just as the ruler of the Mongols, but as a rising power to be reckoned with. The Jin dynasty, once dismissive, now recognized the threat he posed. Yet the Mongols did not commit to a full invasion of Jin territory just yet. Genghis understood the value of patience. He tested his armies in smaller campaigns, refining tactics, building discipline, and gathering intelligence. The Great War against China would come, but only after the Mongols had mastered the arts of siege and supply. Meanwhile, Genghis expanded westward, striking at the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia, a small but wealthy state controlling vital trade routes. Unlike the Jin, the Tangut were more cautious, and when confronted with Mongol power, they chose to submit rather than be destroyed. They became tributaries, providing resources and recognition that further enhanced Genghis's legitimacy. Each submission, each victory, added momentum to his growing empire. The Mongols' success was not merely military. Genghis Khan also built a system of governance to support his expanding realm. He established a postal relay system, using mounted couriers to carry messages swiftly across vast distances. He appointed loyal men to positions of authority, ensuring that conquered lands were administered effectively. He codified laws to maintain order among his diverse followers, ensuring that justice, harsh though it might be, was applied consistently. This combination of military conquest and administrative innovation laid the groundwork for empire. As word of Mongol victories spread, so too did fear. neighboring tribes and kingdoms, once disdainful of the nomads, now faced the reality of a rising power unlike any they had encountered before. Some chose submission, offering tribute in exchange for protection. Others resisted and were annihilated. To those who defied him, Genghis offered no mercy, using terror as a weapon as potent as the bow and arrow. Entire cities were razed, populations slaughtered, leaving survivors to spread tales of Mongol ferocity. To those who submitted, however, he offered protection and incorporation into his growing dominion. These first campaigns revealed the essence of Mongol conquest: swift movement, disciplined armies, cunning strategy, ruthless punishment of resistance, and pragmatic incorporation of the conquered. They demonstrated not only the military genius of Genghis Khan, but also his vision of empire. The Mongols were no longer just raiders. They were builders of a new order, one that would soon expand far beyond the steppe. By 1211, the Mongols were ready for greater challenges. The Jin dynasty, once the overlord of the steppe, now faced an enemy that could no longer be dismissed. The Tangut had submitted, the tribes were united, and the Mongol army was more experienced than ever before. The stage was set for the Mongols to launch their first great war of expansion, a war that would shake the foundations of China itself and announce to the world that the age of Genghis Khan had truly begun. By the second decade of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire had grown from a loose confederation of tribes into a rising power, stretching across the steppes of Inner Asia. Genghis Khan had humbled the Tangut, challenged the Jin, and bound his people together in a system of discipline and loyalty. Yet his vision stretched far beyond China. To the west lay the great trading cities of Central Asia, crossroads of the Silk Road, where caravans carried silk, spices, and precious metals between China, Persia, and the Mediterranean. To control these routes was to control the arteries of commerce that linked continents. It was into this world that Genghis Khan turned his gaze toward the Khwarezmian Empire, a state that sprawled across Persia, Transoxiana, and much of Central Asia. At first, relations between the two powers seemed promising. Genghis sought not war, but trade, eager to secure access to the markets of the Islamic world. He sent envoys bearing gifts and proposals for commercial exchange, a gesture of diplomacy and pragmatism. The Khwarezmian ruler, Shah Ala-ad-Din Muhammad, received these overtures with suspicion. Though the Mongols were becoming known for their military strength, the Shah saw them still as barbarians of the steppe, unworthy of respect or partnership. His arrogance would prove fatal. The first spark of conflict came not from battle but from betrayal. In 1218, Genghis dispatched a caravan of merchants to the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar, laden with goods to demonstrate goodwill. The governor of Otrar, however, seized the merchants, accusing them of spying. With the Shah's approval, the traders were executed, their goods confiscated. Outraged, Genghis sent ambassadors demanding redress. One envoy was killed, another humiliated, their beards burned, a deliberate insult. For Genghis Khan, who placed inviolable sanctity on the person of envoys, this was an unforgivable act. Diplomacy had been spurned, and only war remained. What followed was one of the most devastating campaigns in history. In 1219, Genghis Khan led his armies westward, crossing the great deserts and mountain ranges with astonishing speed. His forces, numbering perhaps 200,000, advanced in multiple columns, moving like shadows across the steppe. The Mongols struck first at Otrar, the city whose treachery had ignited the conflict. After a long siege, the city fell. Its governor was captured, and in fitting punishment for his betrayal, molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears. Otrar was destroyed, its population massacred or enslaved. From Otrar, the Mongols swept across Transoxiana, targeting the great cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, jewels of the Islamic world. These were no mere fortresses, but centers of learning, trade, and culture, with grand mosques and bustling markets. The Mongols, however, showed no awe for their splendor. Their strategy was relentless, combining terror with psychological warfare. At Bukhara, Genghis himself entered the city's great mosque and addressed the trembling citizens. He declared that he was the scourge of God, sent to punish them for their sins. The message was clear: resistance would mean annihilation, Bukhara was sacked, its defenders slaughtered, its treasures looted. Samarkand, one of the richest cities of the region, fared no better. Its walls were high, its garrison numerous, yet Mongol tactics rendered them useless. Engineers, many captured from Chinese campaigns, constructed siege engines, battering rams, and catapults. The Mongols employed deception, feigning weakness to lure defenders into open battle, where cavalry cut them down. When Samarkand fell, its artisans and craftsmen were spared, sent eastward to serve the Mongols. But tens of thousands of ordinary inhabitants were executed, their bodies left as a warning to others. The fall of Samarkand sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. Yet the Shah himself escaped capture, fleeing westward, abandoning his cities and people to their fate. Genghis pursued him with relentless determination, dispatching detachments across Persia to hunt him down. The Mongols crossed deserts and mountains, raiding cities, burning fields, spreading devastation wherever they went. Though the Shah eluded them, dying in exile on an island in the Caspian Sea, his empire was shattered. What had been a powerful state at the heart of Eurasia was reduced to ruins, its cities depopulated, its trade routes disrupted, its prestige annihilated. The campaign against the Khwarezmians revealed the full scope of Mongol warfare at its most ruthless. The Mongols did not merely defeat armies, they destroyed the very foundations of their enemies' societies. Entire populations were wiped out, their towns reduced to rubble. Survivors were driven in terror, carrying stories of unimaginable cruelty. Yet this was not mindless slaughter. Terror was a weapon, deliberately wielded to break resistance before it could form. Cities that surrendered without a fight were often spared, their populations integrated into the empire. Those that resisted were obliterated. In this way, the Mongols turned reputation itself into a strategic tool, conquering not only with arrows and steel, but with fear. The westward march also demonstrated the Mongols' adaptability. They had mastered siegecraft, once alien to the nomadic tradition, by incorporating engineers and specialists from conquered lands. They coordinated vast armies across immense distances, maintaining communication through mounted couriers. They exploited the terrain, using desert and steppe as easily as rivers and mountains. And above all, they moved with a speed that stunned their foes, appearing in places thought unreachable, striking before defenders could prepare. One of the most astonishing episodes of the campaign was the expedition led by Genghis' generals Subutai and Jebe. Ordered to pursue the remnants of the Khwarezmian forces, they embarked on a reconnaissance mission that became a legendary march across the Caucasus. They clashed with the Georgians, defeated a coalition of Russ's princes, and returned by a circuitous route after years of campaigning, leaving behind a trail of astonishment and fear. This journey foreshadowed the Mongol incursions into Europe, revealing the vast reach of their ambition and the mobility of their forces. By the time the war ended in 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was no more. The once great cities of Central Asia lay in ruins, their libraries burned, their populations scattered. The Silk Road, disrupted but ultimately brought under Mongol control, would soon flow again, but now under new masters. The Mongols had not only destroyed an empire, they had demonstrated to the world that no power, however great, was beyond their reach. For Genghis Khan, the conquest of Khwarezm was both triumph and warning. It showed the extent of Mongol might, the ability to project power thousands of miles from the steppe, to crush armies and erase kingdoms. Yet it also revealed the limits of devastation. While cities burned and populations perished, the task of ruling such vast lands remained. Genghis understood that conquest alone was not enough. To endure, the empire would need administration, trade, and the cooperation of those it had subdued. Even amid the ashes of Khwarezm, he began to lay the foundations of governance that would support his empire's expansion in the years to come. The campaign left an indelible mark on history. For generations, tales of Mongol cruelty in Khwarezm would echo across the Islamic world and Europe, shaping perceptions of the Mongols as an unstoppable force of destruction. Yet within the destruction lay a paradox. By obliterating resistance and seizing control of the Silk Road, the Mongols were also creating the conditions for a new era of connectivity, a vast empire where trade and culture could flow across continents under a single, if fearsome, rule. As the dust settled over the ruins of Central Asia, the Mongols turned their eyes outward once more. To the east, the Jin dynasty still held sway in northern China. To the west, new horizons beckoned: Persia, the Caucasus, the distant lands of Europe. The storm unleashed on Khwarezm was only the beginning. The world had yet to feel the full weight of Mongol conquest. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire had carried the Mongols farther west than any steppe army before them. From the deserts of Central Asia to the shores of the Caspian, they had demonstrated a mobility and ruthlessness that astonished their enemies. Yet for Genghis Khan, the campaigns of Subutai and Jebi across the Caucasus revealed an even greater truth. The lands beyond Persia and the steppes of Russia were vulnerable. Great kingdoms lay to the west, rich but unprepared, divided among themselves, and unaware of the storm gathering at their borders. The first real encounter between the Mongols and the princes of the Rus came in 1223, when Subutai and Jebi pursued Khwarezmian remnants into the steppe north of the Black Sea. There they clashed with a coalition of Russian princes and their Cuman allies at the Battle of the Kalka River. The Rus, confident in their numbers, advanced boldly, unaware of the tactics they faced. The Mongols feigned retreat, luring them into pursuit, stretching their lines thin across the open plain. When the moment came, the horsemen wheeled around, encircling their foes in a whirlwind of arrows and lances. The Rus' army was annihilated. Their princes were captured and executed in grim fashion, crushed beneath boards as the Mongols feasted atop them. It was a chilling demonstration of Mongol contempt for their enemies, and a foretaste of what was to come. Yet after this victory, the Mongols did not press deeper into Europe. Instead, Subutai and Jebi withdrew, their mission reconnaissance as much as conquest. They had tested the strength of these Western powers, mapped the terrain, and spread fear across the frontier. It was a preview, a warning unheeded by those who would soon face the full weight of Mongol armies. In 1227, Genghis Khan died during a campaign against the Tangut of Western Sia, his empire already vast but still expanding. His successors carried forward his vision, and under his son Ögedei, the Mongols turned westward once again. By the late 1230s, their armies, now led by Genghis's grandsons Batu and the indomitable general Subutai, prepared to march into Europe. Their target was not reconnaissance but conquest. The first to feel their wrath were the principalities of the Rus. Divided, jealous of one another, and often at war among themselves, the Russian princes could not mount a unified defense. In 1237, the Mongols struck with overwhelming force. They descended upon Ryazan, besieging the city with siege engines and fire. The walls crumbled, the defenders were slaughtered, the city burned to the ground. One by one, other towns fell: Kolomna, Moscow, Vladimir, each reduced to ashes. Survivors spoke of flames so great that the night sky glowed red, of bodies piled in the streets, of terror beyond imagination. Subutai directed the campaign with masterful precision. Winter posed no obstacle to the Mongols, for they were accustomed to harsh climates. Their horses could dig through snow for grass. Their riders could endure cold that froze their enemies. The frozen rivers became highways for Mongol cavalry, enabling them to sweep across the Russian plains with astonishing speed. By 1240, they reached Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, whose golden domes had stood for centuries as a symbol of power and faith. The Mongols surrounded it, battered it with catapults, and when the walls fell, they unleashed destruction so complete that chroniclers wrote of silence in its aftermath, of corpses filling the streets, of a once great city reduced to ruins. From the smoldering remains of Kiev, the Mongols pressed farther west. Their campaign was carefully planned, coordinated across vast distances. Subutai, the architect of strategy, divided the armies into multiple columns, striking simultaneously into Poland, Hungary, and beyond. In the spring of 1241, two great battles unfolded within days of each other, shaking Christendom to its core. In Poland, at the Battle of Liegnitz, the Mongols faced a coalition of European knights led by Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia. The knights, clad in heavy armor, charged with confidence, expecting to scatter their foes. But the Mongols maneuvered with deadly precision, feigning retreat, drawing the knights into disarray, and then encircling them. Showers of arrows cut down men and horses alike. When the dust settled, the coalition lay in ruins, Duke Henry among the dead. To terrify survivors, the Mongols cut ears from the slain, filling sacks as grisly trophies. Almost simultaneously in Hungary, another Mongol army confronted King Baileth IV at the Battle of Mohi. Here too the Europeans believed their numbers and heavy cavalry would prevail, but Subutai had prepared a trap, constructing bridges and crossing points over the Sajo River to outflank the Hungarian camp. When the attack came, it was a coordinated storm. Arrows rained from all sides, catapults pounded the defenses, and cavalry poured into the breach. The Hungarian army was crushed, tens of thousands killed, the survivors scattered. The heart of Central Europe lay exposed. Panic swept through Christendom. Rumors spread of horsemen who came from the east like a plague, who spared no city, who crushed armies with ease. Some believed they were the wrath of God, unleashed to punish mankind for its sins. Kings and princes scrambled to raise defenses, but few could match the speed and coordination of the Mongols. From Poland to Hungary, villages burned, fields were trampled, and churches stood empty amid ruins. Yet just as it seemed that Europe might fall, the Mongols withdrew. In 1242 word came from Karakorum, the Mongol capital, that Ögedei Khan had died. According to Mongol custom, the princes of the bloodline were required to return home to elect a new great Khan. Batu and Subutai, despite their victories, turned their armies back, retreating across the steppes. Europe was spared, not by its own strength, but by the internal politics of the Mongol Empire. The retreat left behind devastation, but also mystery. To the Europeans, it was as if a storm had swept in, destroyed everything in its path, and vanished without warning. Chroniclers wrote of their terror, of knights humbled, of towns reduced to ashes. Yet few understood the true scale of what they had faced. For the Mongols, the campaigns in Europe were but one theatre in a vast empire that stretched from China to the Black Sea. The withdrawal was not defeat, but pause, a turning inward to secure succession. In the decades that followed, the Mongols would not return to Central Europe in full force. Though their presence in Russia endured for centuries, the Russ's principalities became tributaries, their princes compelled to journey to Mongol courts for recognition. The memory of Mongol invasion haunted Europe, shaping its fears and strategies for generations. Knights and kings had learned that their armor and castles offered little protection against the swift and disciplined horsemen of the steppe. The Mongol invasions of Europe revealed both the might and the limits of their empire. They demonstrated an unmatched capacity for mobility, coordination, and terror, crushing armies that had once seemed invincible. Yet they also showed how deeply the Mongols' destiny was tied to their own internal unity. The death of a great Khan could halt even the most ambitious campaigns, pulling princes and generals back to the heart of the steppe. For Europe, the Mongols were a nightmare that vanished as suddenly as it appeared. For the Mongols, the campaigns were but one chapter in their expansion, a demonstration of power on a global scale. Their gaze would turn elsewhere, to Persia, to the Middle East, to China once more. But the memory of their thunder across the plains of Europe would linger, a reminder of the reach of empire and of how fragile the kingdoms of men could be when faced with the fury of the steppe. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched from the Yellow River in China to the shores of the Caspian Sea, a domain without precedent in the history of the steppe. Yet his death posed a question that had haunted every nomadic empire before him. How could a realm forged by one man's genius endure beyond his lifetime? The tribes of the steppe had long traditions of succession, but none had yet managed to preserve the unity of a realm so vast. The fate of the Mongol Empire would now depend on the legacy he left behind and on the ability of his chosen heir to carry the vision forward. By Genghis's design, the title of Great Khan passed not to his eldest son, but to his third, Ögedei. Among the family, Ögedei was known not as the fiercest warrior or the most ruthless leader, but as a man of balance, steady in judgment and able to mediate between his brothers. This choice was deliberate. Genghis had built his empire on loyalty and order, and he knew that without a ruler capable of holding together the fractious nobility, the empire might collapse into civil war. The election of Ögedei in 1229 was marked by the Kurultai, the great assembly of Mongol nobles. There, beneath the endless steppe sky, the princes of the bloodline and the generals of Genghis swore allegiance. Rituals of tradition mingled with the weight of new ambition, for the empire was no longer merely a nomadic confederation. It was a world power, and Ögedei would rule as its emperor. Under Ögedei, the Mongol Empire entered a new phase. While Genghis had laid the foundations of conquest, it fell to his son to consolidate, govern, and expand. The first task was to complete what his father had begun in China. The Jin dynasty still held sway in the north, their golden empire centered in Zhongdu, the city that would one day become Beijing. For decades they had resisted Mongol pressure, but now the full might of the empire was brought against them. The Mongols pressed their advantage with relentless campaigns. Chinese engineers in their service built siege towers and trebuchets that hurled massive stones against city walls. Cavalry raided deep into enemy territory, cutting supply lines and devastating farmland. The Jin, though wealthy and populous, could not withstand the Mongols' combination of speed and siegecraft. In 1234, the dynasty fell, its emperor dead, its cities absorbed into the empire. For the first time, northern China lay entirely under Mongol control. But even as the Mongols triumphed in the east, their armies advanced in the west. Ögedei entrusted his nephews Batu and Guyuk and his seasoned general Subutai with campaigns that pushed deeper into Eurasia. Already the lands of the Rus had been subdued, their princes reduced to tributaries. Now the Mongols looked to expand their influence over the Islamic world and into the very heart of Europe. The great invasions of the 1230s and 1240s, culminating in the victories at Liegnitz and Mohi, were carried out under Ögedei's reign. The thunder of Mongol hooves echoed from the Carpathians to the Yangtze. Yet conquest was not the only mark of Ögedei's rule. He recognized that an empire of this scale could not survive on warfare alone. Genghis had already begun to establish systems of governance, and Ögedei expanded them. At Karakorum, the new imperial capital, he oversaw the construction of palaces, administrative halls, and religious shrines. Merchants from distant lands came to trade. Envoys from across the known world sought audiences, and Karakorum became a symbol of the Mongol shift from nomadic confederation to imperial state. Ögedei also expanded the use of the yam, the relay system of mounted couriers that connected the empire's farthest reaches. Post stations were built at intervals across the steppe, stocked with fresh horses and supplies, allowing messages to travel hundreds of miles in days. This network not only bound the empire together, but also enabled the movement of armies, officials, and merchants with unprecedented speed. The Mongol world was beginning to knit itself into a single organism, united by roads and riders. Despite these achievements, the reign of Ögedei was not without strain. The sheer scale of the empire created tensions among the ruling family. Genghis had divided lands among his sons, granting each an ulus or domain to rule. While all owed allegiance to the Great Khan, rivalries simmered beneath the surface. The House of Jochi, represented by Batu in the west, clashed with the ambitions of Ögedei's own line and with the descendants of Chagatai. Family politics intertwined with strategy, shaping the course of campaigns as much as any battlefield. Ögedei himself struggled with excess. Known for his fondness for drink, he often indulged heavily, weakening his health. Even so, his judgment as a ruler remained respected. His ability to arbitrate disputes between nobles, maintaining the fragile unity of the empire. Yet his death in 1241, the very year of the Mongols' greatest victories in Europe, revealed how tenuous that unity could be. With his passing, the great campaigns halted, for the princes were required to return to the steppe to elect a new Khan. Once more, the fate of the world turned on the politics of succession. The interregnum that followed Ögedei's death exposed the strains of empire. Rival factions vied for influence. Batu in the west delayed the journey back to Karakorum, citing the needs of his campaigns, but also wary of his rivals. In the heart of the empire, the sons and widows of Ögedei sought to preserve their line's dominance, while the Chagatayids pressed their claims. It would take years before a new great Khan was chosen, and in that time the Mongol advance slowed, not because of defeat, but because of the demands of politics. Yet the empire did not collapse. The structures put in place, tribute systems, administrative networks, relay stations, and military garrisons, ensured that Mongol control remained firm across vast territories. Local rulers in Persia, Russia, and China paid tribute, craftsmen and merchants flowed into Mongol service, and the memory of devastation kept rebellions rare and short-lived. The Mongols had built not only through destruction, but also through incorporation, weaving conquered peoples into their system. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. From the shores of the Pacific to the edges of the Carpathians, from the Siberian forests to the Persian Gulf, it spanned continents. Its armies had humbled kingdoms, its networks tied together distant civilizations, and its rulers presided over a realm that seemed unstoppable. But the question of succession loomed like a shadow over every achievement. The unity of the Mongols had always rested on the authority of the great Khan, and without a clear heir, the bonds between the ruling houses strained. The empire was still expanding, but the seeds of division were already planted. As the descendants of Genghis debated and contended, the fate of the empire's unity would hang in the balance. For the moment, however, the Mongol world stood triumphant. Under Ögedei, the conquests of his father had not only been secured but greatly expanded. China's northern heartland lay under Mongol rule. Persia had been subdued, Russia reduced to tributaries, and Europe had been humbled by campaigns that reached its very doorstep. The empire had grown into a force that reshaped the map of the world, and its influence was only beginning to be felt. The age of conquest was not over. Other Khans would rise, other campaigns would sweep across new lands, and the Mongols would leave their mark from the Middle East to the South China Sea. Yet already the story was shifting. The empire was no longer just the creation of one man. It was a dynasty, a system, and a world order unto itself. The Mongol storm had become a Mongol state, and its legacy was only beginning to unfold. In the wake of conquest, there came a paradox. The same armies that had reduced cities to ash and scattered populations across the steppe now presided over an empire that brought a kind of peace unknown for centuries. The Mongols, through terror and destruction, had eliminated rival powers across much of Eurasia. What emerged was not chaos, but order, an order imposed by the will of the great Khan, under whose shadow merchants, envoys, and travelers moved with a freedom unseen since the days of Rome. Historians would later call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, though it was a peace forged by fire and steel. From the heart of Asia, the Mongol network stretched in every direction. The relay system, the yam, allowed messengers to cross thousands of miles in a matter of weeks. Riders carried sealed tablets, granting them the authority of the Khan, and wherever they traveled, fresh horses, food, and shelter awaited them. This system, designed to sustain armies and governance, also served merchants and envoys. Caravans that once risked bandits or warring lords now traveled under the protection of Mongol authority. Roads long fractured by local wars were unified, their routes patrolled by garrisons loyal to the Khan. For merchants of the Silk Road, this was a golden age. Silk from China flowed westward in greater volume, spices from India, and Southeast Asia moved north and west, while silver, furs, and wool from Europe and Russia found their way east. Cities that had once trembled under Mongol siege now flourished as hubs of exchange. Samarkand and Bukhara, rebuilt from the devastation of conquest, bustled once again with traders. In Persia, new markets opened under Mongol administration. Even distant Venice and Genoa profited, their merchants sailing into the Black Sea to trade with Mongol intermediaries. Yet it was not only goods that traveled these routes. Ideas, technologies, and religions flowed across the empire's vast expanse. Paper money, pioneered in China, found its way westward, influencing financial systems far beyond its birthplace. The compass and gunpowder, once confined to East Asia, now began their journey toward Europe. Knowledge, too, crossed these roads. Persian astronomers shared insights with Chinese scholars, while medical texts from the Islamic world reached Mongol courts and beyond. The empire, for all its brutality, became a bridge that connected civilizations. Foreign travelers marveled at this new order, Among the most famous was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who journeyed to the court of Kublai Khan decades later. In his writings, he described cities of immense wealth, roads alive with caravans, and a court of staggering magnificence. Though embellished by the wonder of a foreigner, his tales reflected a truth. Under the Mongols, distances shrank, and worlds once isolated now touched one another. The Mongols themselves, though rooted in steppe traditions, proved remarkably pragmatic in governance. They rarely sought to impose their own religion, instead granting tolerance to the faiths of their subjects. In Karakoram, Buddhist temples, Christian churches, and Muslim mosques stood side by side, a testament to the empire's pluralism. The Mongols demanded loyalty and tribute, but they cared little for the doctrines of their subjects. This tolerance, unusual in its breadth, further encouraged the movement of peoples and ideas across their lands. Yet the peace was not without contradictions. The Mongols had not abandoned their reliance on fear as a weapon. Cities that rebelled faced swift and brutal retribution, and their fate served as a reminder that order rested on submission to Mongol rule. Nor was the empire free from internal strife. Rivalries between branches of Genghis Khan's descendants threatened unity, and regions grew increasingly autonomous as the decades passed. Still, for much of the 13th century, the empire held together enough to sustain the arteries of trade and communication. The Pax Mongolica also facilitated one of history's darker episodes, the spread of the Black Death. Carried along the very routes that allowed silk and spices to flow, the plague traveled from the Mongol dominions of Central Asia westward to the Middle East and Europe. In the 1340s, Mongol armies besieging the Genoese colony of Kaffa reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls, a grisly act that helped unleash the pandemic across the Mediterranean. The very networks that had bound Eurasia together now carried disease on a scale that would reshape societies across continents. For the Mongols themselves, the wealth of the empire was a double-edged sword. No longer confined to the sparse resources of the steppe, the ruling elite now had access to riches beyond imagination. Tribute poured in from every corner, gold and silver from the west, silk and porcelain from the east, spices and jewels from the south. Karakoram and later Khanbalik, the city we know as Beijing, glittered with treasures from across the world. Yet this abundance also deepened rivalries, as different branches of the royal family vied for control over lucrative regions. Even so, the cultural exchange of this era was profound. Artisans from conquered lands were often relocated to serve Mongol needs, creating unexpected blends of styles and traditions. Persian craftsmen worked in Chinese workshops, producing ceramics that bore both Islamic and East Asian influences. Islamic scholars translated Chinese texts, while Chinese technologies spread westward. The empire, though harsh in conquest, had become a crucible of cultural fusion. At the same time, the image of the Mongols began to shift. In lands devastated by their armies, they were remembered as destroyers, scourges who brought ruin and fire. But among merchants and travelers, they were sometimes praised as guarantors of safety, rulers who made the long journey from one end of Eurasia to the other possible. This dual legacy of terror and of order defined the Mongol century. The Pax Mongolica also had political consequences. By stabilizing trade and securing routes, the Mongols inadvertently stimulated the rise of new powers. In Europe, the influx of Eastern goods fueled demand and inspired voyages in search of direct access to Asian markets. In the Islamic world, Mongol conquests disrupted old dynasties, but also opened the way for cultural flourishing under new regimes. In China, the eventual Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, would integrate Mongol rule with Chinese traditions, leaving a legacy that outlasted the empire itself. For a time, it seemed as though the Mongols had created not merely the largest empire in history, but a new world system, where goods, people, and ideas could move across the vast expanse of Eurasia with unprecedented ease. Yet beneath the surface, the forces of fragmentation were already at work. The empire was too vast, its rulers too divided, its foundations too reliant on the charisma of the line of Genghis. Still, the memory of this age of connection would endure. The Pax Mongolica had shown that the world could be linked, that commerce and culture could flow across continents when barriers of war and politics were removed. It was a fleeting moment, born of conquest and destined to fade, but in its wake, it left a vision of global interconnection that future ages would strive to recreate. The Mongol storm had given way to the Mongol peace, and for a generation the world experienced both the blessings and the curses of empire. But peace in the Mongol world was always precarious, balanced on the sharp edge of a sword. Soon the unity of the Khanate would falter, and the vast empire would fragment into competing realms. The age of the united Mongol Empire was nearing its end. The Mongol Empire at its height was a wonder of the world, a dominion that stretched across continents, binding together lands and peoples who had once seemed forever divided. Yet its very vastness carried within it the seeds of division. The vision of Genghis Khan had always rested on the unity of his descendants, on the loyalty of princes to a single great Khan. But as generations passed, that unity frayed. Ambition, rivalry, and distance turned a single empire into a constellation of states, each Mongol in heritage, but each moving toward its own destiny. The first cracks appeared in the years after the death of Ögedei. Without his steady hand, the great family council, the Kurultai, became a battleground of factions. The house of Ögedei sought to preserve its dominance, while Batu, son of Jochi, wielded the power of his armies in the west. The Chagatai line, ruling Central Asia, demanded its share of influence. The very system Genghis had created, dividing lands among his sons while binding them to the great Khan, was now the source of division. Each branch of the family ruled domains that grew increasingly autonomous, their allegiance to the center more a formality than a reality. In the east, Kublai, grandson of Genghis, consolidated his power in China. He inherited the campaigns begun by his predecessors, and by 1279 he had crushed the southern Song dynasty, completing the conquest of China. From this victory he established the Yuan dynasty, ruling from a new capital at Khanbalik, the city we know as Beijing. Kublai embraced many elements of Chinese statecraft, adopting imperial rituals and governing with the assistance of Confucian officials. His empire in China was Mongol in blood, but deeply intertwined with the traditions of the Middle Kingdom. In Central Asia, the descendants of Chagatai held sway, ruling from the steppes of Transoxiana and the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. Their realm, the Chagatai Khanate, straddled nomadic and sedentary worlds, a frontier zone where Persian, Turkic, and Mongol traditions mingled. Here Islam grew in influence, gradually reshaping the identity of the Khanate, even as it retained the memory of its steppe origins. Farther west, Batu established what became known as the Golden Horde. From the Volga River, his descendants ruled over the Ruses principalities, exacting tribute from princes who journeyed to their court for recognition. The Horde was a power that dominated Eastern Europe for centuries, its horsemen feared, its demands shaping the politics of Russia. Yet its culture, like that of the Chagatai, grew increasingly Turkic and Islamic, blending steppe traditions with the faith and languages of the lands it ruled. In Persia and Mesopotamia, Hulegu, another grandson of Genghis, carved out the Ilkhanate. His armies stormed into the Middle East in the mid-13th century, capturing Baghdad in 1258. The Abbasid Caliphate, a symbol of Islamic authority for centuries, was swept away in a tide of blood and fire. The sack of Baghdad shocked the Islamic world, its libraries burned, its scholars killed, its caliph executed. Yet from this devastation, the Ilkhanate established itself as a new power in the region, ruling over a land rich in agriculture, commerce, and culture. Like their cousins in Central Asia, the Ilkhans gradually embraced Islam, and Persian traditions flourished under their rule. These four great Khanates, the Yuan in China, the Chagatai in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, together represented the inheritance of Genghis Khan. Yet though they shared a common origin, they drifted ever farther apart. Rivalries flared between them. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate clashed repeatedly over the Caucasus, their armies battling across mountains and rivers. The Chagatai contended with both neighbors, caught between east and west. Even within the Yuan dynasty, Kublai's successors faced challenges from steppe rivals who rejected the Sinicization of their rule. Religion also played its part in division. While Kublai remained tolerant, his Yuan dynasty leaned toward Buddhism and Chinese traditions. The Ilkhans, once hostile to Islam, converted over time, reshaping their state into an Islamic monarchy. The Golden Horde, too, embraced Islam, aligning with Turkic traditions of the steppe. These shifts created not only cultural divergence, but political alliances and enmities, shaped by faith as well as blood. The Mongol world that had once been held together by the singular authority of the Great Khan was now a world of competing states, each Mongol in descent, but increasingly distinct in character. The dream of a single empire spanning Eurasia gave way to a reality of fragmentation. Yet the legacy of unity lingered. The Khanates remained connected by kinship, trade, and the memory of conquest. Merchants still traveled from China to the Mediterranean under the protection of Mongol rulers, their journeys eased by the shared institutions created in the Age of Empire. Diplomats and envoys still crossed the steppe, bearing letters sealed with the authority of the Khans. Even in division, the Mongol world retained a degree of cohesion that allowed the Pax Mongolica to endure longer than might otherwise have been possible. But cracks widened with time. The Ilkhanate faced rebellion and decline by the 14th century, its rulers weakened by internal strife and external enemies. The Golden Horde fractured into smaller khanates, their unity splintered by dynastic disputes. The Chagatai Khanate, too, divided into eastern and western halves, its rulers struggling to control a land of diverse peoples and traditions. Only in China did Mongol rule endure into the later 14th century, but even there, the Yuan dynasty faced mounting resistance. Chinese resentment simmered beneath the surface, fueled by heavy taxation and ethnic divisions. In 1368, the Yuan were driven from Beijing by the rising Ming dynasty, retreating back to the steppes of Mongolia. The age of a united Mongol empire had passed. What remained were fragments, powerful in their own right, but no longer bound into a single whole. Yet even in decline, the Mongols left behind a changed world. They had redrawn the map of Eurasia, shattered ancient dynasties, and created connections that spanned continents. Their khanates carried forward elements of their rule, blending them with the cultures they had conquered, leaving legacies that endured long after their political power waned. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire was not merely a story of decline, but of transformation. What began as a nomadic confederation had grown into a world empire, and then into a series of successor states, each carrying something of the Mongol spirit, each adapting to the lands they ruled. The unity of Genghis Khan was gone, but the echoes of his conquests still shaped the destinies of nations from China to Russia, from Persia to the steppes of Central Asia. The storm of conquest had passed, and the empire had fractured, but the mark of the Mongols on world history was indelible. Their legacy was not only in the destruction they wrought, but in the connections they forged, the states they left behind, and the transformations they set in motion. The age of unity was over, but the story of the Mongols was not yet finished. For even in fragmentation their influence endured, shaping the centuries that followed. The Mongol Empire at its height had been a force unlike any the world had seen. From the windswept steppes of Mongolia to the fertile valleys of China, from the deserts of Persia to the forests of Russia, the armies of Genghis Khan and his successors had carved a realm that spanned continents. Yet centuries have taught that even the greatest conquests can fade, and the Mongol Empire would eventually fracture into khanates, each with its own destiny. Still, the impact of the Mongols was profound, enduring and global in scope. Their legacy was written not only in destruction, but in the transformations they left behind, subtle and monumental alike. In military affairs, the Mongols set a standard that would be studied and feared for generations. Their combination of mobility, discipline, intelligence, and psychological warfare was unprecedented. Cavalry tactics that allowed a smaller force to outmaneuver and annihilate a larger army would influence armies for centuries, inspiring strategies from Timur's campaigns to European military thought. Siegecraft, once alien to nomads, became a Mongol specialty, learned from Chinese engineers, perfected on Persian battlements, and refined in the cities of Eastern Europe. They demonstrated that the nomadic steppe, often dismissed as backward or primitive, could produce armies capable of reshaping civilizations. Yet their influence went far beyond the battlefield. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative stability they imposed across Eurasia, transformed trade, communication, and diplomacy. The Silk Road, once fragmented and dangerous, became a conduit for goods, ideas, and technology. Spices, silk, paper, and gunpowder traveled westward, while silver, furs, and horses moved eastward. This unprecedented movement of commodities altered economies from China to Europe. Venetian and Genoese merchants prospered, Persian and Central Asian markets thrived, and distant cities learned to accommodate trade on a scale previously unimaginable. The Mongols had turned Eurasia into a connected world, where distance no longer meant isolation. Knowledge, culture, and religion flowed along these routes just as freely. Scholars, artisans, and travelers moved under Mongol protection, sharing innovations that shaped societies far from their origins. Paper money from China, astronomical knowledge from Persia, and military technology like gunpowder began their diffusion across continents. The Mongols were pragmatic patrons of learning, often relocating talented individuals from conquered lands to serve in administrative, military, or cultural roles. The result was a unique cross-pollination of ideas: East and West, Islam and Buddhism, nomad and urban civilization, interacting in ways that reshaped entire regions. Diplomacy, too, was transformed by the Mongol experience. Envoys traveled across Eurasia, bearing letters sealed with the authority of the Great Khan, demanding submission, negotiating alliances, or facilitating trade. These letters, often carried at great speed along the Yam, allowed a single power to coordinate an empire spanning thousands of miles. European monarchs, Islamic sultans, and Chinese emperors all contended with Mongol envoys, learning for the first time the possibilities and the perils of truly global diplomacy. The Mongols had made the world smaller, forcing distant powers into contact in ways that would echo for centuries. The cultural legacy of the Mongols was no less significant. In Persia, under the Ilkhanate, Persian art and architecture flourished, blending Mongol tastes with Islamic tradition. Central Asia became a hub of scholarship and commerce under the Chagatai Khanate. In Russia, the Golden Horde reshaped political structures, tributary systems, and trade, leaving an imprint that influenced the development of Muscovy and, ultimately, the Russian state. In China, the Yuan dynasty integrated Mongol, Chinese, and foreign influences, introducing administrative reforms, infrastructure projects, and cultural exchanges that shaped the Middle Kingdom long after the Mongols returned to the steppes. Across all regions, the Mongols created a world in which cultures met, mingled, and transformed one another. Their influence on governance was subtle but enduring. The Mongols relied on meritocracy in their military and administrative appointments, selecting leaders for skill rather than purely for birth. They codified laws, maintained communication networks, and built institutions capable of managing territories larger than had ever been governed by a single ruler. Though their empires ultimately fragmented, these practices inspired rulers across Eurasia to consider new ways of organizing states, blending centralized authority with local autonomy and balancing coercion with infrastructure. Even in their brutality, the Mongols left lessons. Cities that resisted were often destroyed, while those that submitted prospered. The memory of Mongol campaigns instilled caution and respect for centralized power, shaping the political strategies of kingdoms and empires for centuries. Fear itself became a tool of governance, and the story of Mongol terror would echo across the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. Yet those same mechanisms enabled trade and intellectual exchange, revealing the dual nature of empire: destruction and creation, fear and opportunity often intertwined. The Mongol legacy is also global in perspective. By connecting distant regions, they accelerated the spread of technologies, ideas, and diseases. The Black Death, carried along Mongol trade routes, reshaped populations in Europe and the Middle East, demonstrating the unintended consequences of unprecedented connectivity. Yet the same networks facilitated exploration, commerce, and diplomacy, laying the groundwork for the later age of global exploration and the rise of empires in the 16th and 17th centuries. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Mongols is the reshaping of how people imagined the world. They showed that a nomadic people from the steppes could conquer and rule vast territories, influencing civilizations far from their homeland. They demonstrated the power of mobility, adaptability, and organization, challenging assumptions about what constituted a world empire. Their example inspired leaders from Timur to the Ottoman sultans, and even centuries later, the strategies and institutions they developed would inform the ways rulers projected power across continents. Yet beyond politics, trade, and warfare, the Mongols left a human story, one of ambition, vision, and transformation. From the early struggles of Temujin, who became Genghis Khan, to the campaigns that swept across Asia and into Europe, their history is a testament to the force of leadership, the impact of unity and discipline, and the far-reaching consequences of ambition. They were destroyers and creators, conquerors and connectors, leaving a mark that extended far beyond their immediate rule. By the end of the 14th century, the political unity of the Mongol Empire had faded. The Khanates had splintered, new dynasties had risen in China, Persia, and Russia, and Europe had turned inward. Yet the influence of the Mongols persisted. Trade routes, administrative techniques, cultural exchange, and military innovations all bore their imprint. The world they touched had been irrevocably changed, and the reverberations of their conquests could be traced across continents, centuries, and civilizations. In the end, the story of the Mongols is both awe-inspiring and sobering. They remind us that even the most unlikely peoples, united under vision and discipline, can reshape the course of history. They demonstrate the interconnection of destruction and creation, terror and commerce, conquest and culture. And above all, they show that an empire, no matter how vast, is ultimately a reflection of the people who build it, the systems they create, and the choices they make in wielding power. The Mongols were nomads who became world conquerors. They rode across the steppes to challenge dynasties, topple kingdoms, and redraw the map of Eurasia. Yet beyond the battles and bloodshed, they created networks that linked civilizations, encouraged cultural exchange, and left a legacy that would ripple through time. Their empire was both a culmination and a beginning, a force that reshaped the medieval world and opened the door to a more interconnected global future. The echoes of their rule in trade, governance, warfare, and cultural exchange remain woven into the story of humanity itself, a reminder of the power of vision, ambition, and the sweep of history.